Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Prof Talk Pod. My name is Dr. Becky Achen, and I am a professor of the practice and director of the professional performance program at the University of Kansas, as well as the owner and founder of the Engaged Professor. And I'm here today with my colleague and friend, not sure which one of those should go first, probably friend, Dr. Galen Clavio.
How we doing, Becky? Great to see you again.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining us this week. As I maybe inadvertently teased last week, we're going to talk about a topic called ungrading, which I was introduced to relatively recently through a series of events that happened in my personal and professional life, and happened to be KU does this really great teaching summit every year. I went to it back when I was a student here, so I was pretty excited to come back to it as a professor. And I was scrolling through the breakouts and saw this word ungrading that I hadn't really heard of before, which for me is kind of odd because I've been doing a lot of research in the scholarship of teaching and learning and consider myself to be fairly well versed in some of the newer methods and thought processes. But this one was new to me. And as we were talking last week about generative AI and assignments, I was like, wait a second, this ungrading thing that I knew, that much about last week might be something interesting to consider in a world of generative AI. So we're going to unpack a little bit about what ungrading is and why it might be something that could be of interest to you as a faculty member, or it might not be, because I'm not sure that everybody is maybe in the same thought process as I am in it. So to get started, I guess I just want to share a little bit about what ungrading means real briefly, and then I'm going to actually start by asking Dr. Clavio what his thoughts are after I kind of explain again the basic premise of ungrading. I got my information from reading a couple journal articles and then reading slash listening to this book called Ungrading. And this book was edited, so it's an edited book by Susan Blum. And it is essentially a collection of stories of teachers who have been using ungrading and trying to reduce the emphasis on grades in their classrooms. But about 60% of them are university professors. Some of the teachers in the book are K-12 teachers, mostly on the high school side, and they just talk a little bit about what ungrading looks like. And so from that book, basically the premise of ungrading is that we shift the focus in our classes away from the outcome of the grade, the A minus, the 91%. Can you round me up a point two so I can get that next letter grade, to the process of learning by not grading their work. And there are lots of different forms that the concept of ungrading can take, which we can talk about in just a second. But I'm really curious because this is something that was new to me and I find interesting, and I connect with a little bit because I really don't like the consistent, how do I get an A? Tell me exactly what I need to do. I just want to check mark the boxes and get 100% kind of perception of my students and my classes. But I'm curious what Dr. Clavio thinks of the basic premise of ungrading and taking out grades in our classes.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because, I think for a lot of the different areas that we teach in college, there's always been this top-down feeling, and it is present within how grades are metered out, how GPA points are calculated, so forth, that there is a grading component that has to be hammered onto the top of everything that we do. And I don't philosophically have a problem with saying, well, maybe we shouldn't go about it that way, and that it can be harmful, that it can put too much focus on just getting the grade as opposed to the learning process. And certainly I think it's very much in vogue now to empower, or at least act like you're empowering the student by saying, well, you know what, we really want to make sure you're learning this, as opposed to we want to make sure that you get a grade. The problem, I think, to some degree is twofold for me. And this is where maybe you've got some examples or some items that might change my mind. First of all, I think there are a lot of areas where ungrading just fundamentally doesn't work. And that is generally in heavily quantitative areas, whether that is engineering or accounting or statistics or mathematics, where there is a right answer and there is a process that you have to take to get to the right answer. And the learning is really about getting the right answer. Yes, you need to understand the underlying concepts, but being like, well, I didn't quite get there, but I should still get, the full credit for it, is counterproductive. I actually asked my wife, who's an accounting professor, about this, and she was like, I absolutely hate this idea. because there really aren't wrong, like they're not right answers in accounting that don't involve actually doing the work properly. So that is, I think, of an issue. The other thing, though, and I think this is where, to some degree, I think students oftentimes think they know a lot more than they do in classes, and we have to teach them how to learn as well as teaching them the things that they are learning. And a lot of the ungrading approach that focuses on the learning process assumes that students are both motivated to learn the process as well as able to self-evaluate what their ability to learn the process and execute it is. And without some kind of objective or even curved measure of looking at what students are producing in class, I worry what we end up with is a situation where, because students don't actually learn the learning process, they may not actually be able to take that away from the class. And then you're left with a situation where if you're grading them based upon their own perceptions of things, and those perceptions are low or non-existent, you're not really grading them on anything. So I'd be curious to hear more about where you're coming from on it and how we maybe reconcile some of those issues.
Yeah, I think starting with just the thought about there are some fields, I think even about fields where there are specific knowledge base you have to be competent in that job. Like I want my doctor to know the different parts of the body and how they interact and the systems within my body without needing to necessarily go back and look it up to make split decisions, right? Like there are plenty of fields where I think that there is knowledge and the core concepts that you have to almost test their ability to do, and they have to pass it to get to that next level, to go to med school or whatever that next step is. And I think accounting is a great example of, there's a process you have to get to go to the right answer, but also in the field of accounting there's a lot of, well, we could do it this way and I interpret tax law in this way, or this is the best process for the different ways that we account for expenses. And there's some critical thinking too, so it's like a good mix of both. And I think that you're right that there are some fields where this would be harder. I don't know, impossible, because definitely examples in the book were in fields like biology or math. There was one professor that talked about their math class using ungrading, and basically they had students create portfolios of their work to show progress toward getting the right answer, right? So instead
Mm.
of doing quizzes that you get 3 points on if you get all the answers right, you don't necessarily grade that 10-point quiz and only give them a 30%. You give them an opportunity to go back to that quiz and fix their work, learn the concepts, and then put that in their portfolio. And you basically grade how they got from A to B. So did they learn more? Can they do more than when they started your class? Versus did they do really poorly on the first exam that tanked their grade? They're going to get a C, but really at the end of their class, they're doing B or A level work.
Mm.
That's what I think is kind of fascinating in a field like math or accounting, or even other a medicine. The early on failures of a student then don't become demotivators. They become opportunities to revise and add that to their portfolio of work. So I think that you could come up with some sort of, I would call it like hybrid approach to ungrading, which is what I really loved about the book, is that every single approach they talked about, the teachers were taking where they were willing to maybe step back from an emphasis on grades, but still hold on to the things that they felt were necessary in their discipline. And so it's not like you have to just say, I'm never grading again, and this is all about telling you how, what I thought of your work, and then you can give yourself a grade at the end of the semester and that's the end of it. It definitely is about figuring out where your comfort level is with it, and then including almost the student's reflection and process as part of the grade, versus we give them an exam. I just gave an exam, giving an exam this week in an online class. Like, we don't do anything with that exam. Previously, I wouldn't do anything with that exam after it's done. It's like, you got a 55%. Oops, you don't know these marketing concepts. Let me move to the next ones that aren't going to make sense because you don't know the first ones. And an ungrading approach, instead of grading that exam as a 55 points out of 100, I might have them, I might provide feedback on the exam. Here's where you need to reconsider your answers, think about this topic. And they would basically create an essay telling me and thinking through what they got wrong, why they got it wrong, and how they got to a correct answer. And then the grade that they get on the exam is actually based on the process after the exam and them demonstrating learning post exam versus the initial test, which is way more work for the teacher. Just as, I mean, this is a very obvious
Right.
point, right? Like, this is a lot of work if you're going to do it. And it's probably going to make you pull down the number of assessments you have in a class, because you're not going to be able to do this realistically with students in a 200-person class for 20 assignments. That's just not feasible unless you get to teach only one class a semester, which I know very few faculty, except at R1 institutions, that only teach one class. So those are maybe some ideas to kind of think about the first part of what you mentioned with certain classes not
Yeah.
not being good fits.
Yeah, I really think it's just very situational. And I think, one of the things rarely in a college class does a professor have the ability to adequately evaluate the existing abilities of every student in the class, even in relatively small classes, and then turn around and essentially adopt a different approach from a teaching and learning and grading or not grading perspective for each of those students, and maintain that throughout the course of the semester, and have essentially an equanimity of achieving learning objectives at the end. I mean, I've read a lot about the ungrading process and it looks good on paper, but the more I look at it, the more I think up to myself, if we've got learning objectives in these classes, and it's like the expectation is if you get a passing grade in this class, because we still have to give a grade in the class, like that is not something that universities allow us to get away from. At the end of the class, what are you grading? Are you grading the acquisition of the learning objectives, or are you grading the learning process that they went through, which might not yield the acquisition of all the learning objectives? If you give them a passing grade, you're basically tacitly saying, well, this student learned all of these things that we said were learning objectives, even if through this ungrading process, perhaps they didn't, because they didn't have core concepts or ideas, or they struggled with certain areas. So, what worries me is, I think for one-off classes or culminating classes or project-based classes, there's some benefit potentially to this. But especially in early and mid-college career courses where we're trying to build learning outcomes on top of learning outcomes, not having objective guideposts and telling students you have to acquire these, and whatever method you may be closer or further away from that at the beginning of the class, but by the end of it, you've got to get here. And maybe that involves some uncomfortability on the part of the student in being told, look, you are not grasping these concepts, and your overall grade in the class at the end is going to reflect that unless you apply yourself more and are developing more of these skills. I know that sounds harsh, but that is essentially the fundamental building block of how we do grading and assessment in not just this country, but many other countries. So I worry that if this is applied in circumstances where it isn't um, effective in terms of building learning objectives for future classes, you may end up with a situation where students aren't learning what they were supposed to learn in that class, and now they are progressively further and further behind other students.
So as you were talking, I had this thought, most courses, at least across programs where I have been, a passing grade to move to the next level in a prerequisite, for example, is a C. Occasionally you see a C plus, maybe. Sometimes you see a C minus. And my question, I think, to you from your experience in talking with other faculty, do you feel like a student who earns a C in your class has adequately met every learning objective?
I think it's an interesting question, because at the end of the day, a C is still 73% or above, which is a pretty good ratio in most walks of life. And there's a much larger conversation about the inadequacy of the way that we evaluate grades. Like, how is an A minus, which is oftentimes maybe 0.1% away from an A, somehow worth 3 full grade points less than what it was? I mean, a lot of this stuff doesn't make sense. So I think you could certainly attack the very foundation of how we do grading. But I will say that, the way I've tried to approach it, and it's taken me a long time to get here as an instructor, and I mean, I've been teaching for 20 years at the college level, basically. Um, I've had to really set my prior expectation of what an acceptable grade is for doing good work, but not great work, down to basically a C plus or a B minus. And if you do work significantly above that, then you get into the B plus, A minus, A range. I think a lot of times, because the way that we hand out assignments and how a lot of assignments at the college level are oftentimes just participation or completion grades. Well, those are binary. Those are like you either did it or you didn't do it. And when we're trying to test individual skills, a lot of it depends on what your overall design is of the class and what the assessments are supposed to be actually assessing. Are you assessing, well, did you learn this learning objective? Here were the assignments or the exams that went towards that. With this, it's like if you're talking about process, not grading things throughout the course of the semester is fine, but as you mentioned, the feedback that you have to give to let students know that, hey, you're doing okay in this class, because there's no grade on this, but you're actually falling way behind on this. Like, what is the impetus to make students actually learn at that level? And then what do you do if at the end of the semester they don't? Because if you've approached the ungrading aspect with the idea that they're improving their learning capabilities and their process understanding, and then by the end they're still not getting it, do you fail them at that point? Because you have to give a grade there.
Yeah, I think what is interesting, again, there's like a lot of different ways to approach ungrading, but a couple of the things that might address maybe some of these concerns is that it's not that students, if you use ungrading, they're just all going to get A's. Now, there is a side of ungrading that thinks we should do pass, no pass, right? Pass, fail, all courses should be pass, fail, which, when I'm grading something and I'm trying to decide if this is an 81% or an 84%, I
Right.
would almost welcome a pass, fail because there is so much subjectivity in grading, and when we try to make it objective, it's never going to be objective, except for in cases where there literally is a right or wrong answer, which is for most of us very few of what most of us teach and the majority of us are teaching. Um, but one thing that is interesting about the ungrading is not about, with the end of this semester, you let students give themselves a grade and they're all going to give themselves A's. And because they learned something, you show them the learning objectives and you have them basically create a portfolio and reflect upon how they met them and describe how they met the learning objectives and provide evidence for how they met the learning objectives. And then you have, and again, in a 200-person class, this would be incredibly difficult, but you have them sit down with you and basically justify why they believe that's the grade that they earned. What I found really fascinating throughout the process, and again, they have your feedback from the whole semester to use to think about how they were meeting expectations and whether they were getting the concepts, learning the concepts, understanding the things that they needed to know and be able to do in the right ways, or in any way, really. So then you have them think about what they grade they believe they earned based on where they started and where they are now. And most of the teachers in the book, when they did that process, were almost always bumping grades up. They were almost always having students tell them that they felt that they earned less than what the instructor feels that they earned based on the portfolio they provided, which is crazy. Now, not all the
Well,
time, but that is kind of crazy to think about.
it is. I mean, but I think it actually strikes at a kind of a fundamental issue, which is that you're really putting a heavy emphasis on the self-evaluation abilities of students. And that's not what students come into classes like programmed to do. And that is where I do think that there's some difficulty. And again, it is very situational. There are students I have in upper level sports media classes who clearly understand the basics. And what we're really working on is refinement. What we're really working on is, okay, well, you did this and this is fine, but let's tweak these things. Let's do this. And that to me is never, classes like that have never aligned to a specific A through F system or like, hey, we're going to take exams. I mean, there's many 400 level classes I teach, smaller ones that I don't give exams at all. And what I'm doing is grading students individually based upon the project conduct, and the way that they're doing things and their overall approach. So I'm not opposed to the concept. I think it's a lot less applicable in the bulk of college classes, both because of all of the extra feedback that you're asking already oftentimes overburdened instructors to provide, and because the student themselves really does not have context for what an objectively good process is for a particular area. That's why they're taking the class oftentimes in the first place. And so it's like one of those concepts that if it existed at all levels of education would be, I think, a lot more acceptable to do. But the issue with engagement with material is something that is a fundamental problem at the primary and secondary levels of school. Less so at the primary level, but it gets progressively worse as test results become more important to school districts. Now, I'm all for going back 25 years and removing the emphasis on testing, but I don't have the power to wave a magic wand and do that. And so, what I see, and I'm the associate dean for undergraduate studies here. We have 2,500 students in our school. I see all level of students with all different types of backgrounds and understanding of learning. And what I see invariably with most of them, especially ones that are not going into heavily creative areas where they have done extracurricular work and they realize that there's a lot more to it than just the regurgitating something on a test. They're not really well conditioned to reflect on anything other than the assignments and what to do to get a grade in those assignments. And it's like, well, you could either back the assignments out completely, which I don't think these students are oftentimes very well equipped for that environment, because we have not effectively operationalized the things that they're supposed to learn. We're telling them, you need to learn these things. But for many students, that hasn't sunk in. It's not that they don't connect that midpoint to the endpoint that they're trying to get to, which is why I think in certain areas where you do have that connection, where students have already demonstrated that, and again, this is generally upper level classes where you're, again, working on refinement of process, this makes sense. But I worry at those lower levels, like you either have to design much better assignments that make it clear that this conceptual knowledge is a way to apply, there's a way to apply it that's going to be helpful to you. I don't know if asking them to self-reflect on a process they don't really understand and then have to learn in like a 10-week course or a 15-week course is always great at those levels where they don't have a lot of that context or buy-in intellectually or emotionally to the materials that they're trying to learn.
So I think you just mentioned something we talked about last week too, that buy-in piece. I will say that as I read the stories and think about this is something where the students, if it's going to be effective, would have to buy into the process, but also the value of the content in the course, because it's going to be very difficult to be motivated in a course because we use grades to motivate, right? We do that all the time. Now, I would potentially argue that that's probably the wrong way to use grades, but we do that, especially in courses that students have to take because it's part of the core or it's a prereq and it's necessary-ish
Right.
for what they need to do, but not the core of what they're interested in. And I think that is definitely a challenge if you use ungrading and you've got 50% of the students who are in Calc 101 because they have to get into the business school.
Yeah. No,
And I do think that's challenging.
Yeah, it is. It's just we've had a bunch of different things over the course of the last 15 years in terms of pedagogical theory, which I oftentimes look at the way that the idea is being presented, and I hate being the one that has to come across and say, well, I don't really see how this applies to what we're trying to do, because I understand the idea, and the idea is that there's a worry about the psychological impact of a bad grade on a student at whatever level. But I also think that to some degree there's a theoretical concept that bad grades are somehow a punitive measure being done to punish students, when in reality, when done properly, a bad grade is simply an indicator to a student that they didn't grasp the concept. And it's almost better sometimes to provide that to a student and say, you're not getting this, so let's take a step back and learn it, and then try again and see where we're at. What I'm very fascinated about, and I'm sure that the book, which I have not read, to be clear, but I know you have, perhaps the book has some psychological studies that indicate that some people react well to not having that bad grade, but I think there's a lot of students who react better to the idea that, wow, I need to pay attention here or change the way that I'm approaching this or doing this. I think back to my own experiences where there were certain classes I just didn't quite get. I was always bad with math. I was not great with science. I'm much more of a writing and conceptual person over a practical theoretical person from that perspective. But the bad grades were helpful because it made me realize that I had a lot of work I had to do in a short period of time to learn this topic. Now, the problem there is what you just said. It's like, why do I need to know finite math? I'm not going to use that in the career pathway I'm going in. It was always going to be hard for me to process that as a requirement that I had to do. But that's, I think, where curricular design has to come into play, because there has to be a clear trajectory for students where they understand what classes they're being, asked to take in service of this degree that we've told them that they're going to go get. And some of the challenges we have in higher ed right now is a lot of colleges and universities overload students' credit hour requirements with classes that the college thinks that they need to be like well-rounded citizens, but that most students are not actually coming to school to learn, which creates problems with the basic grasping of concepts and the buy-in of concepts that you're talking about. I think it's a much less of a deal in your major specific courses.
Yeah, I think so. A couple of things, just to circle back. I think we could probably talk about this for another 45 minutes. It's super There's a lot of layers, I think, of complexity here as we think about what this could look like and if it could work. I will say, though, I agree with you that sometimes students almost need to be told, like, you don't understand this. And sometimes the failing grade on the test is the way that we tell them that. I think where a problem I see, and at least what I've heard from student experiences, is too many faculty are not prepared for how to actually help that student go back and try to re-engage with the material. We're just like, oops, you didn't get it. We're going to move on to the next content because we can't leave everybody else hanging because they got it and you didn't. And if we're not thinking about ways to help that student reframe and reconsider some of the stuff that they didn't know, then we're just going to leave them behind. Now, you're also going to have times where that might be indicative that the student needs to reconsider a career path or rethink what they want to do in their life. I've had plenty of students who were like, I was going to be a doctor until I realized how hard it was going to be for me to be a doctor because I didn't get these specific concepts. And so sometimes that's good. It helps people find their pathway. But as faculty, then we have to be much more prepared to handle the student who gets the F and help them and explain to them, right? Like, this is not, you can't do this. This is you need to understand this better and spend more time on it. And then we're back to the issue of motivation
Right.
and specific classes being easier than others.
Yeah,
I did want to.
it's a tough issue, and I think you did a good job of summarizing it there. I mean, to me, it's never just as simple as what's going on in that individual class. It is, how does that class fit into the student's overall perception of what they're doing, and have they thought about things that way? Because, and this is like maybe the last thing I'll say real quick. It's like, you do have students, especially first generation students, who don't understand how the breadth of what they're learning in a college program might connect to a potential career pathway, because most first year college students aren't coming from a background where that was a necessary step for a career pathway. And so it does require, I think, additional work on the front end. It's not undoable, but it requires a lot more conditioning of students when they first get to college and understanding why what they learn in classes is important, and also on the instructor to be able to say, here are our learning objectives, here's why we're learning them, and here's what they will do in service of this larger pathway. And frankly, that doesn't happen in a lot of classes at the college level right now.
Yeah, I mean, we're happy most of them have learning objectives, whether we ever talk to students about them or not. I actually, this is probably a topic for another time, but think that there's a lot of value in helping faculty understand how to map their own classes, obviously, but then how do we communicate our process of class creation and where do we come up with the content? Because I do think a lot of times our students think we just choose stuff, like there's no rhyme or reason to what we're doing. And so I try really hard when, especially if students are like, I don't like this assignment. This assignment was really hard. Why did we have to do this? I try really hard to basically in my online classes send emails and in person talk about why we're doing it and what it's serving in the course as well as in their professional field. And we need to do more of that. And I think that that's maybe a topic for another time, definitely, to talk about how you might approach that. Uh, so the one thing that I wanted to make sure we talked about before we got done for the day was just a little bit about, what are some things, if this is of interest to you, that you might be able to do that don't require you to just throw grades out. And I am I'm really interested in this. I have a vested interest in understanding how we can reduce grade pressure on students. And I was a super crazy high achieving student. I got a B in college in one class, and I still think about it. And it was a B in abnormal psychology, which has literally no impact on my life. And I still think about it. So, I was definitely highly impacted by grades. And I do think that there's value in trying to maybe not just throw them all out, right? But are there some of our assignments where maybe we don't need to give a grade at all? Maybe this is just part of the process. And if a student comes into our class and they have spent the last sports analytics. They've spent the last 3 years of high school in a sports analytics club diving into what sports analytics are. And my initial assignment isn't going to help them because they're already up here when the rest of the students are intro. Like, can we restructure what we're doing to make sure that student is pushing themselves while the rest of the students are getting that intro information? And maybe not always grade assignments, but provide feedback and say, this is in service of your larger project. How do we scaffold and use drafts to provide substantive feedback for students that we then grade a final project of? Like, it doesn't have to be, I'm getting rid of all the grades for my assignments. There's kind of ways to structure it and maybe back off a little bit on the emphasis of grades and then try to help students understand how to grow from a bad grade versus just, oops, I got a bad grade.
It's funny because I was very much not affected by grades. I once failed a class called Introduction to the English Language, which, to be in my defense, that class was an actual like historical introduction to the English language with where the crossover in the Netherlands was for the language in like the 1200s. I mean, anyway, I failed that course. I did fine. I think I've done okay for myself, but my issue, and I think this is actually this is a case that I hear about a lot with, for instance, the business schools around the country, where students come in, and it's almost as if there's a combination of, oh, a bad grade will affect me even if it's a B, and I deserve an A because I've done everything in the class. And it's like, that's not really how it works in a lot of cases. And to some degree, I think just because somebody thinks they deserve a grade or feels an emotional impact if they get a grade that isn't perfect, while I certainly acknowledge that as being an issue, I also think that there has to be a realistic understanding of what a grade is, and the fact that there is no uniform approach to grading. An A should not be considered, well, I completed everything.
Right.
But that's how it is all ultimately really looked at, and that is, to me, problematic because ultimately I think people perhaps don't learn the lessons they should learn from classes because they're focused on the grade. But the flip side of that is, if you're not providing grades for students that are not highly motivated and understand the material, you risk biasing the class and the conduct of the class towards the students who are hypersensitive to grades and not providing the very important direct feedback about how a student is doing to the students that are not that focused on the grades and are more focused on the learning. Because again, I think for you, it's like, for you to be upset still to this day about getting a B in abnormal psych tells me that, I understand your psychology behind it, but perhaps you're focused on the wrong things.
Yeah.
And like, I think instead of completely deconstructing the grading process, which for better or for worse has been arrived at through decades, centuries of educational policy and evaluation and approach, to then swing entirely the other direction because we have high achieving people who are worried about getting a B or a B plus, is perhaps putting emphasis on the wrong side of things. And I think to some degree, a lot of the people that want to approach it from that way are people for whom the learning process and the onboarding process of knowledge is easier than students who perhaps are not as grade focused, but are also perhaps not as on the front foot with educational process and learning. And that's where, again, I think like the more that we bias the process towards the already existing high achievers, the more we risk disenfranchising from an educational perspective the mid and lower level achievers who in some cases need the lower grades to start with to be the kick in the butt that they need to get in the direction that they're going. I don't know if that can really be effectively addressed through feedback and through self-reflection. That's the kind of things that I'm really interested in, and again, I don't know the answers to that, but these are the things I think about because I know I deal with students in a wide variety from backgrounds and intellectual, not capacity, but like how ready they are to learn certain things. And there's so many extraneous factors outside of the classroom that affect all of that. But the classroom is ultimately where the rubber hits the road in terms of the student's academic record. So it just becomes a little more concerning to me and like going too far in one direction or another. Much like I disagree with the almost exclusive focus on testing that you see in a lot of East Asian countries, where it's like, so much focus and so much pressure is applied. There's clearly psychological phenomena that are occurring there that we see in literature that's very damaging to students, and also de-emphasizes a lot of the squishier, like less quantitative aspects of the learning process. So yeah, to me, it's like a balance to strike. I kind of like the balance we have in a lot of colleges and universities right now, but certainly in certain areas, I think that this approach could have some positive effects.
Yeah, and I appreciate the thought too about, still remember another thing that was really impactful for me as a teacher. A couple years into my career at Illinois State, I had a student come up who was like really engaged in class, really seemed to get the concepts, but did C work. And I talked to him after class and he said, Dr. Aiken, I just want to see. That's all. I'm fine with the C. Like, I've got so much other stuff to do. I'm going to put in the effort I need to get that grade, and that's fine with me. And he got the material, he understood it, it was just he didn't wanna put in the effort, and I was like, it had never occurred to me that not everybody wanted to get an A, right? And so that really did, help me recalibrate as I think about, I don't need all students to want to get an A. In fact, I think it's fine if they just want to learn something, which is what I like about the ungrading approach, is focusing on guiding them forward in the learning process. And whether that means that at the end of the semester they are doing B level understanding or C level or A level understanding, that allows us to take the high achievers and push them, because we focus on, here you started here, how have you progressed? And the students who started down here, we still can progress them all and have them demonstrate progress toward learning outcomes. I like that about ungrading. I like the focus on how we progress from point A to point B and what that means about where our knowledge is when we're leaving the class. And that might be A, it might be B, it might be C, it might be D. I like that idea of ungrading. But like you, there's a lot of challenges with that, especially when it comes to student reflection and are they ready to really think through that process. But I will say that even if you want to keep grades, you like the structure of grades, I love a good rubric. Any student of mine that watches this, they're going to be like, this doesn't sound like Dr. Aiken, because I am crazy about rubrics. And the rubric structure doesn't work as well in ungrading, but I do think there are ways that we can make sure that we're at least considering the learning process in our assignments and in the way that we give feedback, the opportunities we give students to revise work and work together to understand what they did wrong and what they could improve on. Again, harder in a 200-person level class, but an exam wrapper can be done at any level with any number of students in a classroom. So those are things to think about as you think about where you're at with this ungrading idea and how you might be able to integrate some aspects if you think that this would be beneficial for your students, or if you have some other challenges that we didn't talk about or think about today. I know we're going longer than we usually want to. So I want to just mention one more thing, because I promised I would talk about it last week. I do think the ungrading process provides opportunity when it comes to the use of generative AI, because we shift our focus from the outcome that students submit to us and grading the outcome to grading the process. So as a student, I can put a prompt into ChatGPT, even if I tried for 10 minutes to reprompt it, and come up with a pretty good paper on just about any topic that exists in the world,
Mm-hmm.
and submit it. If me as a teacher is just grading the outcome, they might have actually met all of the requirements for that assignment. So then what do I do? Because I can't assess if they learned the thing. I can assess that they could put it into ChatGPT and get it out. So ungrading, if we focus on the process and having students talk through and show us and demonstrate and provide evidence and explain their learning, does give us a potential opportunity to focus actually on how they got to the end result versus the end result itself. And then AI becomes part of the process and they can tell us how they used it. And it's not, even though I tell my students they can use AI in my classes, they just have to tell me how, they still will not tell me. They still will not disclose it, even though I know they used it because I put the same prompt into ChatGPT and it gave me mostly the same answer that it gave them. But they're so scared that that's going to negatively impact them. But if we start grading the process versus the outcome, then I can more effectively communicate to them how they can share the generative AI use as a process element and not as an end result. So,
Yeah, it's tough, and so much is dependent on the context of the class, the context of what they're trying to learn, what we want them to get out of the class. And I think I mentioned this last time, but my answer to the generative AI aspect has been twofold. One, and I know people don't want to hear this, but to me, when calculators came into vogue, we didn't tell people, no, you have to write that math out by hand. I mean, some classes still try to do that, but realistically, in practice, we didn't say that in society. We weren't like, well, sorry, we're not going to hire you to work for this firm if you can't calculate, a z-score by hand, or you don't like it. Like, we used it as a tool, and as much as we are focused on learning concepts, ultimately, if the computer is there and it's going to generate all of this content that's going to adequately answer a question, well, that becomes a tool that we should probably be embracing from a societal perspective and from an educational perspective, not saying don't use that because we can't demonstrate that you've learned if you type this prompt in. There are ways to change assignments and prompts so that it's not easy to get that material out of generative AI right now. That'll probably change, though, as generative AI becomes better. But that, to me, it's like, then we need to take a step back and say, well, what is learning concepts at that point? Because it sounds like what you're asking for is like, well, think about this and write it by yourself. That's probably that's something that computers will be able to do better than humans, and in some cases already do better than humans. So you're asking a student who's an intelligent person generally at the college level to take the harder pathway to
yeah.
get what would essentially be a worse answer, but say, well, this was my worse answer, as opposed to just putting it into the computer. So I think we need to fundamentally reevaluate how we approach things. And maybe it's a situation where we have to reevaluate how we're teaching classes, and we're going more to oral responses as opposed to written prompts that people turn in that we grade later. The response that I've done is, well, they have to do a podcast on the topic as opposed to doing a written thing. Now, they could certainly go generate the answer and then read the answer into the podcast, but hey, at least then they read verbally what they came up with, and some of that probably processed. I think it's a much bigger issue, and it goes beyond even the grading process or the assessment process, because unless then you're having small group or one-on-one conversations where you're able to adequately assess on your own what students know and don't know, I think it's going to be very easy for students to leverage generative AI in those sorts of circumstances to come up with those answers. I'll also say, like, as someone who teaches media, it would be irresponsible of me to tell students don't use generative AI, or don't come up with good things in generative AI, things even like graphic design. Like, I want someone to be able to design graphics on their own, but if you can type something into a computer and it generates something in a way that's better than you can do on your own, it's hard for me to turn around and say, sorry, you have to learn that on your own, unless you're really motivated to do it. And so there's a lot of elements here philosophically that I would like to explore further down the line. And again, a lot of it is really the core issue as instructors and teachers. Like, how do we assess what our students know and learn? And it almost requires a fundamental reevaluation of how we're doing the assignments and the assessments in the first place.
Yes, and I will just say one last thing that I've had a couple conversations about with other faculty is if they can put this thing into generative AI and get the answer, maybe we need to reconsider the things that we're teaching our students. We need to be teaching them the things that they can't just get an answer from a computer for, right? So then are we looking at reevaluating learning objectives and outcomes and what am I asking students to do that I barely test my students unless it's in a gen ed course, because there is very little in marketing that they're going to have to do without being able to look up something on the internet, right? Very, very little. So most of the time, assignments are about applying and becoming creative and thinking through processes and how we do things strategically. And then in that instance, AI becomes part of our process. So that's why I think that's an opportunity,
I,
because you can teach them how to use it and see actually grade their ability to use it effectively as
right.
part of the outcome, which is a lot more powerful, I think, than trying to grade an outcome.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, I just go back to there's what we do in the classroom where we're supposedly trying to teach process. But when they get out into the real world, even in like an internship situation, well, what are they going to do? Well, let me plug this in and see what the computer says. I understand why people don't like that. I'd also like, other than I don't like that, you need to have a better argument against it, because I don't like
Yeah.
that is not something. There's math people who can do quadratic equations by hand without breaking a sweat. I'm not one of those people. If I have to solve that, I'm going to plug it into the damn calculator. So like when you think about, again, going back to the motivations of the student and the practical
Yep.
applications of what we're trying to teach them, if you tell a student you can either walk an hour to get where you need to go, or you can hop in a car and get there in 3 minutes, but we really think you should be walking instead of being in the car, I guarantee the student's going to hop in the car 100 times out of 100. So that's where, when you're structuring these things, I think you have to understand fully what Gen AI can do and what it can't do, and codify for students what it can't do, and also demonstrate in the assignments they're generating, if they're going to be using generative AI, why the answers are not adequate for what they actually need to learn. That's, again, more work on the part of the instructor. And that's where I think our jobs just get progressively more difficult, because we are still operating under educational practices and policies that frankly were built for a generation ago or 2 generations
Right.
ago. It's going to be an interesting thing to see as it moves forward.
Definitely. Definitely. Okay, well, that was a great conversation. I think it's something that there's a lot of discussion, a lot of nuance. Some things might resonate with you and work well in your context, others might not. If it's a situation where you think you want to explore this, but you're not really sure how you might be able to do it, the Ungrading book is really, really good. As I mentioned in my newsletter this week, I have it on audio, ebook, and paperback copy. So you can get it in any of those formats. I think that's a really good place to start. It's really accessible. And then they give you recommendations in the book for other resources. You're always welcome to email me at Becky at theengagedprofessor.com. You can also find that. I'll put the link in the description for the show. And I'm happy to just give you some feedback or kick around ideas. Would
There,
more than happy to do that.
that's
That's the
the book.
book.
I was trying to get it to load. It wouldn't load. I finally got it to load. So there you go.
Yes, there is the book.
Awesome.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Clavio, for joining us. And thank you, listeners. We would love your feedback. So feel free to rate the podcast or give us a review, or just reach out to us and let us know what you think, questions, ideas, things you want us to talk about. We're definitely open to that. And see you next time.